Good evening and happy Halloween, everyone. I'm your host, the undead body of Evan Claymore, and I'm here to wish you all a stiff, cold welcome to a special Halloween episode of Sounds of the Valley. Normally on this show, I bring on a local artist for an interview and a live performance, but since I'm in the Halloween spirit, I decided to give you something different. Instead, you'll have to participate in the scariest activity of all time, learning. That's right, I'm officially presenting for the first time Evan's Spooky Mystery Hour. Wait, mystery? I'm not mysterious at all. I mean, I'm a music guy. Clearly that meant music history hour, right? Hang on a second. There we go. So since it's Halloween, I figured I'd tell y'all about the history of the spookiest, scariest music genre of all time, psychedelic rock. Let's dive in. Our story begins in 1958 when a young guitarist named Chuck Berry took inspiration from a time-traveling teenager and released a song called Johnny B. Good, thus inventing music as we know it. Now, Johnny B. Good wasn't the first rock and roll song, but it had such an explosive energy and catchiness to it that it came to define the genre. Chuck Berry, along with his contemporaries like Bo Diddley and Little Richard, took the country by storm, proving to a generation of young listeners the force and intensity that rock could have. But by the end of the decade, the first generation of rock and roll artists made like a tree and got out of there. And who else was fit to take the stage after them but those same young listeners they had influenced? Artists like Eddie Cochran and Buddy Holly, who, believe it or not, was actually a real guy before he was a Weezer song, were some of the artists that defined the second wave of rock and roll. The sound of the wave was markedly different as well. Chuck Berry's brand of rock and roll was high energy, with fast tempos and driving guitar rhythms. The brand of these new artists was focused more on experimentation. They borrowed rhythms from other genres and used the rock instrumentation in different ways. But their most important innovation wasn't in the playing. It was in the equipment. Let me introduce you to a guitarist named Link Wray. Much like the other artists of his time, Ray's goal was to set himself apart. Specifically, he wanted to capture a guitar sound that no one else had. The average guitarist would try to do this by modifying their guitar or their amp in some way. Technically, this is what Ray did, but the way he did it proved that he was far from being an average guitarist. To record his song Rumble, Ray took a razor blade and deliberately cut holes in his speaker cones, resulting in a guitar sound that was so abrasive and distorted that it got the song banned from many radio stations throughout the country. To this day, Rumble is the only completely instrumental song to ever be banned on American radio stations. The influence of the song was massive, though. Before long, manufacturers were selling amps that came with distortion pre-packaged, no razor blade needed. Recording technology was improving incredibly fast at the time, too. Stereo sound was becoming popular, allowing for the instruments to be panned from left to right, and effects like reverb were becoming easier and easier to add in post-production. All of these effects gave artists a lot of room to experiment with the sound, and from the early to mid-60s, that's exactly what they did. Surf rock and garage rock were becoming incredibly popular in America, and both focused heavily on capturing that same fuzzy guitar sound. Combine all this with other elements of the 60s, and by 1967, the genre we know as psychedelic rock, or psychedelia, was ready to take the stage. Now, there really was no first psychedelic rock song. The sound more appeared gradually as more and more artists adopted its signature, trippy, distorted production style. However, the first group to use the word psychedelic to describe it was the Austin garage rock band, the 13th Floor Elevators, with their album, The Psychedelic Sounds of the 13th Floor Elevators. Once the term caught on, though, it stuck. Psychedelia was also known for its close associations with the hippie counterculture movement of the 60s, which gave the genre its vivid, colorful imagery and lyrical themes of protest and free love. It's also ultimately what caused the genre to absolutely explode onto the mainstream scene in the summer of 1967, where the hippie movement reached its greatest audience in a social phenomenon known as the Summer of Love. Suddenly, not only were new psychedelic bands cropping up everywhere, but they were also achieving incredible success and gaining enormous followings and influence. The biggest names in the US were the Jimi Hendrix Experience, The Doors, Cream, and the Grateful Dead. Meanwhile, across the pond in Great Britain, a little band called Pink Floyd was gaining some recognition of their own. These guys seem like they've got promise. I wonder if they'll make it big someday. Now, it wasn't just new bands embracing the psychedelic sound either. Several already established groups, especially those left over from the British invasion earlier in the decade, were doing some psychedelic experimentation of their own. Some of the albums that resulted from this are The Who's The Who Sell Out, The Rolling Stones' Their Satanic Majesty's Request, and the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. 1967 was such an incomprehensibly massive year for psychedelic rock that you'd expect the genre to fizzle out just as fast as it blew up. However, in 68 and 69, its following just kept growing. It all culminated in the summer of 1969 with the very first Woodstock Music Festival. As many as 400,000 people showed up across 3 days to watch 32 acts perform, including the likes of Jefferson Airplane, the Grateful Dead, and Jimi Hendrix. If any single moment could be seen as the zenith of psychedelic rock, as well as the 60s counterculture movement in general, it was Woodstock 69. From where everyone stood, it might have seemed like psychedelic rock would never die. Unfortunately for us, though, we know how the story ends. Let's keep going. No good thing can last forever, and sadly, psychedelia could not be the exception to the rule. At the turn of the decade, and seemingly all at once, many of the genre's most talented and influential trailblazers were lost. Figures like Jim Morrison from The Doors, Brian Jones from the Rolling Stones, Syd Barrett from Pink Floyd, and Jimi Hendrix were killed or worse. After the loss of so much talent, the future of psychedelia was left unclear. Additionally, the rock landscape at large was beginning to shift and break apart. New groups were developing in wildly diverging directions, and entirely new genres were finding their footing. Black Sabbath released their self-titled debut album in 1970, spawning the heavy and aggressive genre of metal. Meanwhile, King Crimson released their colossus of a debut album, In the Court of the Crimson King, introducing the public to progressive rock, a genre defined by incredibly intricate composition, virtuosic playing, and songs so long you need to mark them on your calendar. Some groups went in the opposite direction, returning to the straightforward blues-defined rock structure of the early 60s. Some prominent adopters of this back-to-basics style were Creedence Clearwater Revival, the Allman Brothers Band, and Led Zeppelin. In the wake of all these diverse and exciting developments, where was psychedelia left? Well, many of its surviving artists experimented with the new genres. The Doors found their footing with blues rock, and Pink Floyd, in the wake of Syd Barrett's sudden departure, full sent into progressive rock and never looked back. The writing on the wall was clear. Psychedelic rock was a thing of the past. In just a short 3 years, it rose to an unreachable height and then fell all the way back down, straight into its grave. The grave of psychedelic rock lay undisturbed for several years while life continued on for music at large. New trends in rock and pop came and went until we reached the site of our next chapter in this psychedelic saga, the early 80s. Above all, the music landscape of this era was defined by scorn and derision toward the styles of old. Psychedelia and blues rock were the tired, decayed past. The future was synth pop, new wave, and perhaps the most insidious of all, glam metal. However, the 80s were also an era that dared to ask difficult questions like, what if nerds could sing too? And from that came the first wave of British post-punk, headlined by bands like The Cure and the Talking Heads. Post-punk's attitude reflected that of the second wave of rock and roll, back in the late 50s. Less outwardly energetic and aggressive, but more open-minded toward experimentation and innovation. Many post-punk groups sought to create music that was different from anything else that you could find at the time. One of those groups was the Flaming Lips, fronted by Wayne Coyne along with his brother Mark. To set themselves apart from their contemporaries, the Lips drew from where they knew no one else would dare, that ignored grave of psychedelic rock. Across their first several records, the Lips combined the established post-punk sound with influences in sound from early Pink Floyd and the Jimi Hendrix Experience, creating what was, in essence, an entirely new genre, neo-psychedelia. It took a while for the Flaming Lips to make a splash in the scene. They weren't even signed to a major label until 1992. But even when they were underground, the roots of neo-psychedelia that they were laying down were taking hold. It wasn't anywhere near as big of a movement as the original psychedelic wave in the 60s, but bands like Primal Scream, Blind Melon, and the Stone Roses found success with the sound. Neo-psychedelia never really went mainstream, though. During its main wave in the late 80s and early 90s, it kept mostly to indie and alternative groups. But this actually helped the genre more than it hurt it, because since neo-psychedelia was never at the center of the public eye, it managed to stick around while new trends came and went. Not at the forefront, but on in the background. It could be argued that that's where our story ends. Psychedelia never quite entered the public consciousness again. To most people, it's a relic of the past, relegated to a time of tie-dye shirts and flowers and hair. However, it's more complicated than that, and that's because of the simple fact that music is built on influences. Genres are a flawed, messy way to try and fit people's styles into categories. They're an attempt to categorize the uncategorizable. The overbearing cliché truth is that everyone is a sum of their influences. And that's what brings us back to psychedelia. Because although the movement of psychedelia has dissipated, its influences are still around. Artists in the present day are still borrowing elements from psychedelia. Bands like Animal Collective, King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, and Tame Impala, who's actually just one guy, didn't you know, are a few that continue to expand the psychedelic sound into wildly different places. Seriously, listen to these 3 albums and notice that they sound nothing like each other. They're all still psychedelic, though. Additionally, many bands from the neo-psychedelic revival, including the Flaming Lips and Primal Scream, are still actively touring and releasing new music. So even though the movement's gone, psychedelia never actually died. Even now, no one's safe from it. Isn't that a spook? So now that we're done with the lecture part, I get to recommend y'all some of my favorite pieces of psychedelic rock for you to listen to, and to get you more into the genre. So, for some of that classic original psychedelic rock, check out any of the Jimi Hendrix Experience's 3 albums, because they're all gold. The fan favorite is Are You Experienced, but my personal favorite is Electric Ladyland. Also check out the self-titled album by The Doors, Piper at the Gates of Dawn by Pink Floyd, and if you really haven't listened to Sgt. Pepper yet, then get on that right now, seriously. For some good neo-psychedelia, check out Clouds Taste Metallic and The Soft Bulletin by the Flaming Lips, and also Screamadelica by Primal Scream. And then for some of that really good modern stuff, pretty much anything by Tame Impala is great, but especially Lonerism. And then Animal Collective can get really weird sometimes, but if you're cool and you like weird music, check them out for sure. Specifically, listen to Merriweather Post Pavilion and Strawberry Jam. And one last recommendation, of course. It may not be psychedelic rock, but it is Halloween, so you're required to listen to Monster Mash at least once. Do it now. But with that said, that's about it for this Halloween. Thanks to everyone for tuning into this special episode of Sounds of the Valley. You can check out our other shows at mytv10.uwec.edu or on our YouTube channel at UWEC TV10. I've been your host, the undead body of Evan Claymore. Good night, y'all.